Okay, so today we are going to be talking about gender and sexual fluidity. Um, so first off, we have just the basic concept of what is gender fluidity. Gender fluidity can have a couple different meanings. It can be changing or discovering your gender identity over time, or the actual gender identity of someone who does not have a fixed gender. That's what we would call gender fluid. Um, I personally am gender fluid, and it's um, a fun time. Basically, the person that identifies as gender fluid, um, they can feel binary. Like they can feel binary, they can feel non-binary, they can feel any sort of gender on any given day, week, month. It can change within the day too. So, for example, I could wake up in the morning. I usually don't go by gender, I usually go by pronouns, but a gender fluid person could wake up in the morning and say, okay, well, I feel transmasculine this morning. And then later on in the day, they could realize, like, oh, I feel like something's changed. I feel more non-binary, or it can go anyway. Um, Gender fluidity is really just an open concept, and it can change so fluidly. Like that's why we call it gender fluid. Um, Gender fluidity is not concrete. Even though gender fluid is a gender identity, it's also just a free concept. You don't have to identify as gender fluid to have gender fluidity. So, for example, we can think of it as like the discovery of your gender identity over time. So for me, I have gone through many gender identities. I have been a trans guy, I've been non binary. Now I identify as gender fluid. There's been a time where I identified as agender. Um, and at those points in time where I said, like, yes, I'm a trans guy, I'm non binary, I'm agender, I didn't identify as gender fluid because that's not the label that fit me at that time. But over time and over my own discovery and realization, that's just what worked for me. Someone who discovers their gender identity over time doesn't even necessarily have to be gender fluid. Your gender identity can change at any given moment. Or you could just maybe not have it quite right. Or maybe you don't have all the knowledge. Maybe, there's a more specific term for your gender identity that you just don't know yet. Maybe it's really specific and the term that you're using is kind of more broad. And then you find, say, for example, you realize you're a demi boy. For example, like you could be a trans guy for a while and then you find the term demi boy and that just fits you better. So it's really about your labels and how they match you and really gender fluidity and being gender fluid um, really only applies to you if you are identifying as gender fluid. So, what I'm trying to say here is you don't have to be gender fluid to experience gender fluidity. Now we'll move on to sexual fluidity. It's similar to gender fluidity, where there's two different meanings. Um, So it could be just changing or discovering your sexual identity over time, or it could be the sexuality of abrosexuality, and that's someone who does not have a fixed sexuality. Now, like I said with gender fluidity, sexual fluidity is not concrete. Abrosexuality is a very real and very valid sexuality, just as it is with gender fluidity. Um, Your sexuality is free to be fluid in general. You may discover your sexuality over the years. I've gone through handfuls of sexualities over my lifetime. I've identified as bisexual, pansexual, I've identified as a lesbian, briefly I identified as straight. Um, I forgot all the sexualities I've said. I've just gone through so many different sexualities. Um, and during those points in times, it didn't mean that I was abrosexual. It's just how I was. And like I said with gender fluid, you don't have to identify as abrosexual if you do experience this sexual fluidity. Um, like I said, your sexuality can be fluid in any way, and that doesn't have to mean that you're abrosexual. If that's how you want to define yourself, then that's completely up to you, and that's your choosing. Now, This next slide is a video by Ash Hardell, and I will leave a link to it. But this is just a really good kind of overview of abrosexuality and kind of getting a better meaning in it. Because I'm personally not abrosexual, and if I am, I haven't claimed it yet. Um, and I don't have the experience in that. And I don't believe Ash is abrosexual as well, but they have a pretty good sense of it. And I really like her video on it, so I'll leave a link to it. Moving on, simply put, abrosexuality. Um, Someone who's abrosexual might feel pansexual one day and then asexual the next. It's similar to gender fluidity, where instead of their gender changing, it's their sexuality changing. So someone could wake up and kind of feel more bisexual, and then later in the day, maybe they feel like a lesbian. Like, that's all up to them. Now, abrosexuality and gender fluidity are not the same. While they are similar, they don't have to go hand in hand and they aren't the same. Gender fluid people can identify their sexuality in any way possible. They don't have to be abrosexual. Just because their gender changes doesn't mean that their sexuality has to change too. Or even if it does, they don't have to apply that abrosexual label to themselves. They can identify with whatever labels they choose. And similarly, abrosexual people uh, are not all gender fluid. They can be. They can be. Um, but they aren't all. Abrosexual people can be of any gender identity, just like gender fluid people can be of any sexuality. Now, there's a couple gender fluidity and abrosexuality myths that I have found, or just have thought of, or had even personal experience in. Um, I've heard people say that gender fluid and abrosexual people are going through a phase. Um, they're not. And even if they are, it's still important to validate them in those moments when they're identifying that way. Um, some people may say that those people are faking their sexuality or gender identity. I personally, as a gender fluid person, don't see why anybody would want to fake gender fluidity or abrosexuality, because it's kind of hard to keep up with. And I mean, think about it. For gender fluidity, you don't have to express your gender how you feel it on a certain day. But if you're choosing to express your gender identity, that's multiple wardrobes you have to buy, and that's expensive in general. It's just a difficult thing to do. And it's just not really it's doesn't really make much sense to fake your gender fluidity or abrosexuality. Most people don't know what abrosexuality even means. I didn't know what it meant for a really long time, and I knew about sexual fluidity, but I didn't know the term for it. So I don't know why anybody would fake specifically that. The same thing with gender fluidity. Um, some people might say that they're doing it for attention. And you know what? Wanting attention isn't a bad thing anyway. However, your gender identity or your sexuality is not something that you're doing for attention. You're doing it for you. Most people are doing it for themselves, not for other people. And even if they are doing it for attention, so to speak, that's not a bad thing to want attention. It's not great to use a gender identity or sexuality for attention. But like I've said, validate people however they want to identify. And also, if there's an issue of them doing it for attention, give them that attention that they need. Um, and I've been told this one personally, uh, that gender fluid and abrosexual people have multiple personalities. That's not always true. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I would like to point out that having multiple personalities shouldn't even be an insult, shouldn't even be a thing that we talk about in a negative way. Obviously, I think it's completely fine to talk about it and bring awareness to it, but we shouldn't be using that as an insult. People with multiple personalities or anything of the sort shouldn't be used in such a negative way. And gender fluid and abrosexual people can have those things, but Their gender fluidity and abrosexuality does not mean that they have multiple personalities. They are one person. They are usually one personality. And like I've said, those people can have multiple personalities. It doesn't mean that they can't, but they don't all have it. Obviously, it's important not to believe these myths or not to internalize them as a gender fluid or abrosexual person or just someone exploring it in general. It's important not to believe things that other people might say about you because you know you best. And other people can't tell you who you are or why you're actually doing things. And lastly, I just have a couple tips, I guess, on how to interact with gender fluid and abrosexual people. Now, these are basically just rules of decency and respect, um, and just understanding in general of people in general. And it can be implemented when asking abrosexual people or gender fluid people about their identities. And honestly, these can kind of go for any identity in general. So the first thing that I have is asking pronouns for the day. This is specifically for gender fluid people. Um, a lot of gender fluid people may not like. I say a lot. I don't. I can't um, talk about the entire gender fluid population because I don't know every single gender fluid person. But out of the two gender fluid people that I know, which is myself and my friend, if you ask us pronouns for the day, a lot of the time we don't know. But when we do know, we do like to be asked and we do like people to use them. And I would assume that goes for every other gender fluid person. Um, and some gender fluid people might just have a set of default pronouns. Like, for example, if I don't know or if I'm just meeting someone and I don't feel comfortable telling them that I'm gender fluid, I'll just say that my pronouns are they, them and go with it. And unfortunately, I won't even bother if I don't feel comfortable around those people. But if I feel comfortable around you, and if you make the effort to make me feel comfortable enough, um, and make me feel comfortable by having you ask me my pronouns, that really helps. Um, Now another thing is not pressuring someone um, to tell them their sexuality on any given day unless it's actually relevant to the conversation or for yourself. I personally think there's very few instances where it's actually really relevant, and some abrosexual people might be completely fine with it, but not all people will be. Abrosexual people are more than willing, if they're more than willing to be open about it, then that's fine and that's on them and they can discuss it however they want. But it's important not to pressure people into talking about things that maybe they don't want to talk about. Maybe it just isn't a thing that needs to be brought up. Really, the only times that I can think of where it would be relevant is if you're, say, for example, if you're that person's partner, or, it does get brought up into conversation. Those are really the only two situations that I can think of it being relevant in. This doesn't mean that that's definitive, but I think that's kind of just like a privacy thing. Not a lot of people always want to talk about their sexuality every single day. Some people might, but not everybody does. And also, you kind of have to think about people's safety when we're talking about these things. So, like, if you're introducing a new friend to an abrosexual person, you probably wouldn't want to walk up to them and be like, "Hey, this is my new friend. By the way, what's your sexuality for the day?" It's it kind of outs them. Um, which not everybody likes being outed. Most people don't like being outed. Most people like to talk about themselves and their identities in their own way. Now, the last one is really just a blanket term or a blanket statement, so to speak. And that's just asking questions that you would be okay with answering yourself. So, this is really relevant in the trans community, well, just in all queer communities, honestly, in my opinion and from my viewpoint. Uh, the first thing that I think of whenever I read this is, asking trans people what's in their pants or asking gay people how they have sex, who wears the pants in the relationship. Like, just really inappropriate questions or just questions that are commonly known by the queer community that are inappropriate and that we're pretty much not comfortable answering. A lot of the time, these questions are coming from cisgender people and straight people that really don't understand. The trans question of what's in your pants comes a lot of the time from transphobic people. So hearing those kinds of questions is just kind of like, I don't want to say a trigger, but it's kind of like, it is sort of a trigger of like, okay, well, I don't want to have this discussion. This person's asking really invasive questions. I don't want to talk to them anymore. I have to avoid them. And I think an easy way to avoid asking these inappropriate questions is just thinking if you'd be okay with answering them yourself. If you would be okay with someone walking up to you and saying, "Hey, what do you have in your pants?" I and maybe this is me personally as a trans person, I'm trying to imagine this in a cisgender person's head and viewpoint where they'd be comfortable with it completely and not a little bit creeped out that someone's wondering what's in their pants. Um, but I don't really think that most people would be comfortable answering that question. And it's also a thing of like, why do you care so much about what's in someone's pants? Really, it should only be relevant if you're trying to get in them, quite honestly. Um, I guess another question that you could think of is just like, okay, well, the thing with like, oh, well, how do you have gay sex? Like, how do two women have sex? Do you want me asking how, say, like a straight person in a straight relationship asks that question? How would how would that straight couple feel if I asked them how they had sex? They probably wouldn't be too comfortable with it. So you just kind of have to keep in mind of like really what's appropriate. And I mean, it's just general etiquette, honestly. And it's just really a lot of the times the queer community gets these questions so often and they feel homophobic and transphobic. So we try to avoid them as much as possible. And I think for a lot of the community, it makes us really uncomfortable whenever they're asked because there is such a link to the homophobic and transphobic context to those questions. So that's all I have for today. I don't know what my next topic is going to be. It's I don't know what it's going to be. It's probably going to be something trans related. If you have any suggestions, feel free to leave a comment. Um, I'm not going to ask for you to like or subscribe because I don't do that. But if you have any suggestions, leave a comment and let me know, and I will try to cover that as best as possible. This presentation was actually created for my university's they do a discussion-based group. They have a discussion-based group. It's called Queer Conversations, and I was asked to present on this topic because I'm gender fluid. So I made this for that group, and it I felt like it went well. There were only 3 people that showed up because end of semester and finals, and everybody's stressed with finals. Anyway, I appreciate you taking the time to watch this if you've made it the whole way through. Like I said, feel free to leave a comment. I will leave the link to Ash's video in the description, and I will see you all next time.